September 2nd, 1945, the formal surrender of Imperial Japan to the Allied powers was signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan. It was the official end of World War II. The day became known as V/J Day for Victory over Japan Day. As news of the Japanese acceptance of surrender was official, Americans began celebrating victoriously, including the largest crowd ever formed in New York City's Times Square. For some, however, the war never ended. Soldiers known as holdouts were rare cases of soldiers who were cut off from communications and the rest of their army. These holdouts would hold the belief that the war was still ongoing, and in certain cases, would attack others on sight that they might perceive to be the enemy. The majority of holdouts would be discovered shortly after the end of World War II, but some would manage to last much longer than that. This is the story of a man who refused to surrender for nearly 30 years. This is the story of Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda. Born on March 19, 1922 in Kamikawa Village, Japan, Hiroo's family belonged to an ancient samurai caste whose ancestors were trained as officers in military tactics. Hiroo's father was a sergeant in the 4th Cavalry Brigade of the Japanese Imperial Army, so it was no surprise to his family when Hiroo enlisted at 18 years old. Hiroo Onoda was then trained as an intelligence officer at Nakano School, a military training center. Students were heavily trained in counterintelligence, covert operations, sabotage, martial arts, and foreign languages. Graduates from Nakano School were highly intelligent and very deadly spies capable of holding themselves behind enemy lines for a long time. December 26, 1944, Hiroo was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines. His instructions were to hamper and harass the enemy by any means, including destroying various naval targets with a group of Japanese soldiers who were there previously. Hiroo was given instructions by his superiors to never surrender or harm himself under any circumstances until the Japanese Imperial Army returned to the island. In that time, he was forced to stay on the island and stall Allied forces as a spy for as long as possible. In February of 1945, the Allied forces retook the island and many of the Japanese soldiers on the island were killed or captured. Hiroo and 3 other soldiers were the last remaining survivors. Retroactively promoted to lieutenant and now the highest ranking surviving officer, Hiroo ordered his men to retreat deeper into the heavily forested mountains of the island. Hiroo Onoda and his 3 surviving men continued participating in guerrilla tactics, hunting, killing farm animals when permitted for food, and engaging in hit-and-run shootouts with the Philippine police for months after the official Japanese surrender of World War II. Local islanders knew that Japanese holdouts were living in the mountains and made several attempts at contacting them. Many who attempted to directly confront the men were attacked on sight. Some islanders tried alternative methods such as leaving leaflets by raided farms saying the war had ended and to surrender themselves peacefully. One of Hiroo's men had found a leaflet left by a farmer on their property who then brought it to Hiroo. Hiroo concluded through his intelligence officer training that the letter was Allied propaganda and likely a trick. At the end of 1945, hundreds of leaflets were dropped into the mountains of Lubang Island that were copies of a surrender order from General Tomoyuki Yamashita of the 14th Imperial Army. Hiroo Onoda had declared this evidence to be falsified, along with other efforts of getting him and his comrades to surrender. Some of these efforts included loudspeakers relaying a pre-recorded message in areas where Onoda's men had raided for supplies, and leaving newspaper clippings of the Japanese surrender at various locations on the island. Over the years, Onoda had one of his men surrender to authorities in 1950, and his 2 other men were killed in brutal shootouts with the Philippine police. Onoda was the last of his men, living alone in the mountains of Lumberg, where he continued to soldier on alone. He had his orders: continue the mission at all costs, never surrender or end his life until the Japanese Imperial Army returned and told him to stand down. It was now 1974, and almost 30 years since the end of World War II. Local islanders on Lumberg knew that there was some Japanese World War II holdouts still alive and in hiding. Incidences of sabotage and farm animals being slaughtered were still occurrences. Islanders would also report the sightings of a Japanese man in his late 50s living in the mountains armed with a rifle and an imperial sword. A former college student, now turned Japanese wanderer and traveler named Norio Suzuki became enamored with the stories of these Japanese imperial holdouts on Lumberg Island. It was, at first, not known exactly who they were, as many Japanese records of World War II soldiers who were spies were destroyed by the Japanese government at the end of the war. Norio Suzuki began to do intensive research on the names of soldiers in the Japanese Imperial Army, including those that were labeled missing in action or killed in action. Suzuki came to believe through the few remaining records and interviewing local islanders on the sightings of the Japanese soldiers that were seen that Hiroo Onoda was still alive. On February 20th, 1974, after several failed expeditions in attempting to locate Hiroo Onoda on Lumberg, Onoda chose to voluntarily show himself to Suzuki after seeing him multiple times alone in the forest. Onoda would later write, "If it had not been for him wearing socks, I might have shot him, but he had on these thick woolen socks even though he was wearing sandals. The islanders would never do anything in such a way. Socks while wearing sandals is a common Japanese fashion." Suzuki was both terrified and fascinated that Hiroo Onoda was alive and standing in front of him. Saluting him, he got on his knees and begged for Onoda to return to Japan with him and that the war was over. Onoda would later write, "His use of polite Japanese expressions convinced me he was indeed brought up in Japan and not a gaijin, but he was rushing things too much. Did he think he could just make that simple statement that the war was over and I would go with him? After all those years, it still made me angry that I was abandoned if it was true. No, I won't go back," I told him. "For me, the war has not ended." Onoda admitted to Suzuki that he was the last holdout of the Japanese Imperial Army on Lumberg Island, and became friends with him after repeated meetings but refused to come out of hiding. Onoda told Suzuki that he would return to Japan with him under one condition: if his commanding officer came to formally tell him to return. Onoda allowed Suzuki to take photographs of the two together as proof that he was still alive. Suzuki returned to Japan with the photograph as proof to the Japanese government. Surprisingly, Onoda's commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, was still alive and working as a bookseller. March 9, 1974, Suzuki returned to Lumberg with Major Taniguchi in full military uniform to confront Onoda with other members of the Japanese military. Onoda emerged from the forest as he finally laid down his arms, which included his imperial sword, his still functioning Arisaka Type 99 rifle, 500 rounds of ammunition, and multiple hand grenades. Hiroo Onoda had finally formally surrendered and was relieved of duty. Throughout the years, Hiroo Onoda and his three companions managed to kill over 30 Filipinos and Americans. They also wounded more than 100 people. Given the unusual circumstances that Hiroo had gone through, he was officially pardoned for his crimes by the Filipino president Ferdinand Marcos. Hiroo Onoda returned to Japan where he received a hero's welcome, although anger still remained in the Philippines for his actions. Onoda was given a large sum of money owed to him in back pay by the military, but he refused it at first. When pressed to take it, he instead donated it to a shrine that commemorates Japanese soldiers who died during World War II. Onoda would later go on to release a book titled No Surrender, My 30-Year War, and became affiliated with a Japanese nationalist association that wished for Japan to return to a monarchy. On January 16, 2014, Onoda finally died of heart failure at St. Luke's International Hospital in Tokyo, Japan. While some may regard Hiroo Onoda as a stubborn madman, his refusal to give up is awe-inspiring. Surviving the mountains for nearly 30 years with no supplies and help would have broken lesser men much earlier. He is the personification of never giving up, never quitting, and surviving at all cost. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you next time on Horrors, Freaks, and Creeps.